Oh, death, the great equalizer. No matter how famous, talented, or wealthy, it's the one thing we're all gonna experience one day. And for all their otherworldly genius, the great composers were no exception. Some of the most celebrated musical minds left us suddenly, while others lingered through painful illnesses. From strokes and heart attacks to mysterious final moments, this video will explore the final days of 30 of history's most famous composers. Strokes were one of the most common causes of death among composers, with Johann Sebastian Bach being one of its most notable victims. Bach, one of the most revered composers of the Baroque period, and known for masterpieces like the Brandenburg Concertos and Toccata and Fugue in D minor, led a life filled with music but marred by health issues in his later years. Born in 1685, Bach suffered from rapidly declining vision as he aged, which eventually led him to seek surgical help, a decision that would prove disastrous. In 1750, he underwent eye surgery twice at the hands of one John Taylor, a traveling eye surgeon infamous for his unorthodox and risky methods. The procedures not only failed to restore his eyesight, but also led to severe complications, leaving Bach bedridden and weakened. Soon after, he suffered a stroke, which, combined with the likely infection from the surgeries, contributed to his rapid decline. He died on July 28, 1750, at the age of 65. The disastrous effects of Taylor's surgeries weren't limited to Bach. Another of his famous patients, George Friedrich Handel, would face similar consequences after the same operation. Handel, known for his famous Messiah oratorio and numerous operas, enjoyed immense fame during his lifetime. Like Bach, Handel was also born in 1685 and enjoyed decent health during his early years. However, as he aged, severe health complications began to emerge. His obesity, which he carried through most of his life, may have played a role in the series of strokes he endured in his later years. The first of these strokes occurred in 1737 at the age of 52, leaving his right side paralyzed. Remarkably, he recovered and continued composing, but his health would not improve for long. Over the next several years, Handel endured a total of 4 strokes. In 1751, his eyesight would rapidly worsen, ultimately leading him to the same fateful decision that Bach had made, to undergo surgery by the notorious John Taylor. Handel's first operation left his vision severely impaired. Desperate to restore his sight, he turned to Taylor again, but the results were disastrous. Handel continued to compose, even in his near blindness, a true testament to his resilience. However, his health steadily declined in the years that followed. In 1759, Handel suffered another stroke, which left him partially paralyzed and severely weakened. He died on April 14, 1759, at the age of 74. Handel, enduring multiple strokes, finds a parallel in the life of Hector Berlioz, who faced a similar fate in his final years. Berlioz, one of the leading figures of the Romantic era, is remembered for his grand, innovative compositions, most notably the Symphonie Fantastique. The passionate composer was no stranger to inner turmoil, which took a toll on both his mental and physical health. Despite a relatively healthy start in life, his later years were plagued by various ailments. In his 50s, Berlioz began to experience a rapid decline in health, suffering from symptoms attributed to a combination of digestive issues and severe neuralgia. These chronic pains often left him bedridden, and his condition steadily worsened. By the time he entered his 60s, Berlioz was enduring relentless episodes of physical pain, alongside bouts of depression. In his final years, Berlioz suffered a series of strokes that left him partially paralyzed. The once fiery composer was reduced to a frail state, unable to find relief from his suffering. On March 8, 1869, at the age of 65, Berlioz passed away after suffering another stroke, leaving behind a legacy that would inspire future generations, though tragically, his genius was largely unappreciated during his lifetime. Unlike Berlioz, who struggled for recognition during his lifetime, Giuseppe Verdi achieved remarkable fame and admiration throughout his career. Known for his iconic operas such as Aida, Rigoletto, and La Traviata, Verdi became a revered national symbol during Italy's unification, inspiring immense pride in his homeland. Remarkably, he was one of the few composers blessed with both a long life and relatively good health, allowing him to enjoy his fruitful career well into his later years. Even as he reached his 80s, he continued to compose with undiminished passion. In his final days, Verdi's health took a sudden downturn with a stroke that ultimately proved fatal. Fortunately, unlike so many others, he was spared a prolonged period of suffering. He passed away on January 27, 1901, aged 87. Just 3 years after Verdi's passing, another great composer of the era, Antonín Dvorak, would also succumb to a similar fate. Dvorak, known for his New World Symphony and Slavonic dances, earned widespread admiration in both his native Bohemia and abroad. Unlike Verdi, however, Dvorak's death came with less public fanfare. Though he'd enjoyed good health throughout most of his life, Dvorak faced a sudden decline in his final years. In the spring of 1904, Dvorak fell ill with what was initially thought to be a minor respiratory infection. However, his condition worsened rapidly, and within weeks, he suffered a stroke that left him bedridden and severely weakened. Despite the best efforts of his family and doctors, Dvorak's health continued to deteriorate, and he passed away quietly on May 1, 1904, at the age of 62. After his death, Dvorak's legacy continued to resonate, particularly in Bohemia and the United States, where he had made a lasting impact. Half a century later, Sergei Prokofiev would face similar health struggles in Soviet Russia. Sergei Prokofiev, known for works like Peter and the Wolf and Romeo and Juliet, was among the Soviet Union's most celebrated composers. However, his final years were marred by intense physical and emotional strain. Prokofiev faced increasing health challenges, which many believe were exacerbated by the Soviet state's restrictions and pressures. By the 1940s, he began to suffer from debilitating headaches, which doctors suspected were related to hypertension. Despite his worsening condition, Prokofiev continued to compose, though his output was limited. His health took a final downturn in the early 1950s, culminating in a stroke that left him weakened and bedbound. He passed away on March 5, 1953, at the age of 61. Ironically, the same day as Joseph Stalin, whose oppressive rule had cast a long shadow over Prokofiev's life. Though Prokofiev's death received little recognition due to Stalin's passing, he was at least fortunate enough to have seen his 7th decade. In contrast, Felix Mendelssohn would meet his end well before old age, the youngest composer on this list to succumb to a stroke. Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, the prodigious German composer known for works like the Overture to A Midsummer Night's Dream and the Italian Symphony, was celebrated from a young age for his musical talent and disciplined work ethic. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Mendelssohn enjoyed a stable, supportive family environment and a relatively healthy life. However, his family was plagued by what would later become known as the Curse of the Mendelssohns, a genetic predisposition to berry aneurysms which causes sudden, often fatal strokes. This condition had claimed the lives of many of his family members at relatively young ages. Tragically, Mendelssohn would suffer a similar fate. After the sudden death of his beloved sister, Fanny, who succumbed to a stroke in 1847, Felix was overwhelmed by grief. The heartbreak seemed to exacerbate his own health issues, and later that year, he suffered a series of strokes that left him physically and emotionally weakened. Mendelssohn passed away shortly after, on November 4, 1847, at only 38 years old. While strokes claimed the minds of many great composers, others were undone by ailments of the heart. Igor Stravinsky, one of the most influential figures of the 20th century, was one such victim. Stravinsky, composer of The Rite of Spring and The Firebird, lived a life marked by both artistic innovation and recurring health issues, from tuberculosis and typhoid fever in his youth to more severe conditions in his later years. A dedicated performer and conductor even into his 80s, he continued his work despite these challenges. In his final years, Stravinsky developed polycythemia, a rare blood disorder that led to clotting complications. This condition, combined with recurring strokes and heart issues, significantly impacted his mobility and quality of life. In early 1971, his heart began to fail, and he suffered from pulmonary edema that confined him to his bed. Despite various treatments, his condition steadily deteriorated. On April 6, 1971, Stravinsky passed away in New York at the age of 88, his health finally succumbing to the accumulation of issues he'd endured over a lifetime. While Stravinsky's final years were marked by a series of medical crises and interventions, Joseph Haydn's decline unfolded much more quietly. Haydn, celebrated as the father of the symphony, led a life of stability and success that few composers of his time enjoyed. He spent much of his career under the patronage of the Esterházy family, where he thrived, composed prolifically, and was widely respected. As Haydn aged, however, he began to experience episodes of fatigue and shortness of breath, signs of the heart troubles that would eventually claim his life. By 1802, his health had deteriorated to the point that he could no longer compose, though he remained socially active and continued to graciously receive visitors. In May 1809, as Napoleon's forces advanced on Vienna, Haydn's health took a final turn. Aware that the end was near, Haydn spent his last days with close friends and passed away peacefully on May 31, 1809, at the age of 77, succumbing to what was most likely heart failure. His departure marked the end of an era, but his legacy lived on, inspiring countless composers. Yet, even in death, Haydn's story took an unusual turn. In a bizarre act of phrenological curiosity, Haydn's skull was stolen shortly after his burial and was not fully returned to his tomb until over a century later. While Haydn's life ended with a slow farewell, Richard Wagner's final days were marked by the kind of intense drama that befitted his larger-than-life personality. Wagner, the revolutionary composer behind the Ring cycle, lived with grand ambition and equally grand health struggles. Known for his intense personality and groundbreaking music, Wagner also dealt with numerous ailments throughout his life, including skin conditions, persistent headaches, and heart problems, likely exacerbated by his high-stress lifestyle. In 1882, Wagner's health took a severe downturn during a stay in Venice. He suffered from angina, experiencing intense chest pain and difficulty breathing. Despite worsening health, Wagner continued composing and preparing performances, driven by an unyielding commitment to his art. Tragically, on February 13, 1883, at the age of 69, he suffered a fatal heart attack in the arms of his wife, a dramatic end in keeping with his passionate life. Wagner's death was a devastating blow to the world of music, but his work continued to influence and inspire. His heart troubles are mirrored in the life of another composer, the great Gustav Mahler. Mahler, celebrated for his monumental symphonies, was known as much for his intense music as for his intense personality. Both a composer and conductor, Mahler's career was marked by emotional highs and lows, which may have contributed to his health issues later in life. He suffered from persistent throat problems and would later develop issues with his heart. By his late 40s, Mahler was diagnosed with bacterial endocarditis, a severe infection of the heart lining that would ultimately claim his life. Despite his illness, Mahler refused to slow down. He continued conducting and composing, pushing himself to extremes. His Ninth Symphony, often interpreted as a farewell to life, reflected Mahler's intense preoccupation with mortality as his health declined. By 1911, Mahler's condition had worsened, prompting him to travel to Paris in search of experimental treatment. Unfortunately, the treatments proved ineffective, and his health deteriorated rapidly. Soon after, Mahler returned to Vienna, where he spent his remaining days surrounded by family. On May 18, 1911, Mahler succumbed to his heart infection at the age of 50, marking the end of one of music's most profound voices. Had he lived just a few years longer, it's possible that the development of antibiotic treatment might have saved him. Mahler's intense preoccupation with mortality wasn't unusual among composers. Arnold Schoenberg, another towering figure in the early 20th century, harbored his own deep fears of death, fears that ironically seemed to foreshadow his own demise. Arnold Schoenberg, the godfather of atonality and the 12-tone technique, was a composer of tremendous influence. Yet, behind his innovative music was a man gripped by chronic anxiety and a lifelong fear of the number 13. A phobia that seemed to cast a shadow over his life. Born on September 13th, Schoenberg's apprehension about the number grew with age. His final years were marred by respiratory ailments, including asthma, which left him frequently short of breath and physically weakened. His frailty amplified his anxiety, and the stress of his phobia may have exacerbated his condition. On that fateful day of Friday, July 13th, 1951, his worst fears materialized. Schoenberg's superstitious dread, combined with his poor health, kept him confined to bed as he waited for the day to end. Unfortunately, a few minutes before midnight, he suffered a fatal heart attack at the age of 76, a number that, when its digits are added, ominously equals 13. Schoenberg's battles with respiratory and heart issues finds a parallel in the life of Edvard Grieg, whose own respiratory struggles defined much of his later life. Edvard Grieg, the Norwegian composer known for the Peer Gynt Suite and his piano concerto in A minor, held a unique place in music, infusing his compositions with Norwegian folk traditions and melodies. His career brought him widespread acclaim, but it also came with considerable physical strain. Grieg faced numerous health challenges throughout his life, beginning in childhood when he suffered a severe lung infection that left him with lasting respiratory issues. Despite these struggles, he remained dedicated to his work, often composing while traveling to perform. In his later years, Grieg's respiratory issues were compounded by heart problems, which worsened as he aged. By 1907, his condition had declined significantly, yet he persisted with his busy schedule, performing as much as his health allowed. Eventually, however, his ailments became overwhelming, and Grieg spent his final months in and out of hospitals. On September 4, 1907, Grieg died of heart failure at the age of 64. His life and death bore some similarities to that of Dmitri Shostakovich, as both composers grappled with a combination of respiratory and heart issues. Shostakovich, the Soviet Union's most celebrated composer, left a significant mark on 20th century music with works like his Leningrad Symphony and Eighth String Quartet. While his musical achievements were monumental, his personal life was marked by extensive health struggles. Of these, his heart problems would prove most severe, beginning with the first of several heart attacks in 1966. Later, he was diagnosed with lung cancer, a consequence of his lifelong chain-smoking habit. By the 1970s, his health had taken a severe turn, with his cancer symptoms worsening alongside his cardiac problems. He succumbed to heart failure on August 9, 1975, bringing his long, resilient career to a close at the age of 68. As a notable parallel, the famed American composer Leonard Bernstein faced a similar decline in health, with a life shaped by both a substantial musical output and the toll of his own chain-smoking habit. Leonard Bernstein, the legendary American conductor and composer of West Side Story, was as renowned for his music as he was for his magnetic personality. A lifelong chain smoker, Bernstein had struggled with respiratory issues for years, suffering from emphysema, asthma, and chronic bronchitis. Despite his declining health, he remained active in music, composing, teaching, and conducting into his later years. By the late 1980s, Bernstein's condition had become critical, and he was diagnosed with a pleural tumor, an illness that compounded his respiratory troubles. Even so, he resisted hospitalization, preferring to stay in his Manhattan apartment surrounded by friends and family. In his final days, Bernstein famously continued his work and even spent his last hours listening to music. He passed away on October 14, 1990, at the age of 72, from a heart attack brought on by his emphysema. While Bernstein's fate was largely shaped by his smoking habit, he was not alone in battling the effects of this vice. Another musical giant with a similar habit was Franz Liszt, whose lifelong tobacco use likely contributed to the significant deterioration of his health in his final years. While cardiac issues proved fatal for many composers, others faced a slow decline as respiratory illnesses took their toll. For some, like Franz Liszt, a lifetime of smoking and unrelenting work contributed to a gradual yet devastating erosion of health. Franz Liszt, a colossal force in 19th century Romanticism, was more than a virtuoso pianist. He was a cultural phenomenon. In his prime, Liszt was worshipped by adoring fans who swooned at his performances and elevated him to near mythical status. But Liszt was human, and time revealed his mortality. As he grew older, he lost his teeth, and his body became swollen. His lifelong smoking habit led to major respiratory problems like asthma, emphysema, and chronic bronchitis. By 1886, Liszt was incredibly weak, yet he made the journey to attend the Bayreuth Festival in Germany, a beloved event. There, he fell ill with pneumonia. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and despite medical care, his body could not withstand the illness. On July 31, 1886, Franz Liszt passed away at the age of 74, a poignant reminder of the fragility of even the most exalted figures. Liszt's one-time friend and fellow romantic icon, Frédéric Chopin, also faced the relentless toll of respiratory illness, though his fate came far sooner. Frédéric Chopin, the Romantic-era virtuoso pianist and composer, is best known for his exquisite nocturnes, waltzes, and ballades. While his musical genius was extraordinary, his physical constitution was remarkably fragile. His respiratory system was especially weak, providing fertile ground for the tuberculosis that would ultimately claim his life. Around the age of 25, his condition began to worsen significantly as he started experiencing painful coughing fits that left him spitting blood. Those close to him suspected he was consumptive, a term for those suffering from tuberculosis, and his poor health likely contributed to the failure of his first engagement. Despite these hardships, Chopin remained devoted to his music, composing and performing whenever his strength allowed. By the late 1840s, now well into his 30s, Chopin's condition had deteriorated sharply. His weight plummeted, and he was often bedridden. He spent his final days in his Parisian apartment, confined to his bed and being cared for by his sister and close friends. On October 17, 1849, he succumbed to his illness at the age of 39. Chopin's long battle with tuberculosis demonstrated how some diseases could wage a war of attrition against their victims. He would not be the only composer to face such a fate. For Claude Debussy, it was not his lungs, but an insidious cancer that marked his final years, a tragic chapter from one of music's most innovative minds. Claude Debussy, hailed as the father of musical impressionism, despite detesting the term, is best known for his iconic works such as Clair de Lune and Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. His creativity was overflowing, even as his final years were overshadowed by pain and uncertainty. In 1909, at the age of 46, Debussy was diagnosed with colorectal cancer, a condition that would plague him for the remainder of his life. At first, he concealed his illness, attempting to maintain his rigorous schedule of composing and performing. However, the cancer's progression soon began to interfere with his work. By 1915, he underwent one of the earliest surgical attempts to remove the tumor, but the procedure left him physically and emotionally drained. Despite moments of hope, his health steadily declined, and he would die on March 25, 1918, at the age of 55. The shadow of cancer, which had claimed Debussy, also loomed over Sergei Rachmaninoff, whose final years were marked by his battle with this relentless disease. Sergei Rachmaninoff, a towering figure in both stature and late Romantic-era music, was celebrated for his sweeping piano concertos and lush symphonies. Standing at an imposing 6'6", his remarkable presence mirrored the grandeur of his music. Throughout his life, Rachmaninoff battled recurring bouts of depression, but it was in his later years that his physical health began to sharply deteriorate. He began suffering from chronic back pain and arthritis, ailments that were likely made worse by his towering frame. A persistent cough and respiratory troubles also plagued him, worsened by his smoking habit. These issues made playing the piano, a cornerstone of his identity, more difficult as time went on. In 1942, he received a diagnosis of metastatic melanoma, a devastating blow for the 69-year-old composer. Despite his declining health, Rachmaninoff continued to perform, giving his final recital just a month before his death. Rachmaninoff would pass away on March 28, 1943, in Beverly Hills, California, just days shy of his 70th birthday. As Rachmaninoff's life came to a close, he joined a long line of composers, including Johannes Brahms, who had fought against the unyielding grasp of cancer. Johannes Brahms, one of the most revered composers of the Romantic era, is celebrated for his symphonies, chamber works, and the hauntingly beautiful German Requiem. Unlike so many of the other composers on this list, Brahms enjoyed remarkably good health for most of his life. In fact, he was so healthy that when he began experiencing sickness in his later years, he was deeply alarmed. His vigor began to wane in 1896, when the first symptoms of liver cancer appeared. By early 1897, the cancer's toll was undeniable. His once stout figure became gaunt, his skin pale, and his eyes yellowed from jaundice. On February 18, 1897, a stroke paralyzed the left side of his face, and by March, Brahms could no longer leave his bed. A steady procession of friends and physicians visited him in his final days, among them his protégé, Antonin Dvorak. His final days were marked by significant suffering, including rectal bleeding and delirium, as the cancer made its final rounds. He passed away in Vienna on April 3, 1897, at the age of 63, leaving behind a profound musical legacy. While Brahms had been blessed with years of good health before his decline, Ludwig van Beethoven, the towering genius to whom he was so often compared, was not so fortunate. Of all the composers on this list, Beethoven might just hold the dubious honor of being the unhealthiest. As if going deaf wasn't challenging enough, Beethoven endured a bewildering array of ailments throughout his life, almost as if fate itself was determined to see just how much he could take. Over the course of his life, Beethoven dealt with persistent abdominal pains, diarrhea, frequent vomiting, smallpox, recurrent colds, bronchitis, fevers, jaundice, migraines, eye pain, infections, nosebleeds, swollen feet, and gout. Despite these challenges, he somehow found the strength to push forward, pouring his suffering and his indomitable will into his music. Unfortunately, Beethoven's final moments were also among the most miserable of the great composers. His last illness dragged on for months. He wasn't so lucky to have been afforded a quick death. His liver, ravaged by cirrhosis likely brought on by years of drinking cheap wine, began to fail, causing his body to retain massive amounts of fluid. In a series of excruciating procedures, doctors repeatedly drained the fluid without anesthesia. Each procedure brought only temporary relief, with the fluid soon returning and the agony mounting. Finally, on March 26, 1827, Beethoven's suffering came to an end at the age of 56, leaving behind a legacy that would resonate far beyond his tortured life. Just as Beethoven's already dreadful health further unraveled with liver cirrhosis, Erik Satie, another odd yet brilliant figure, would encounter his own struggles with the same affliction a century later. Erik Satie, known for his whimsical gymnopédies and eccentric personality, lived a life as unconventional as his music. A bohemian figure in Paris's avant-garde circles, Satie embraced a deliberately peculiar lifestyle. He wore identical suits every day, collected hundreds of umbrellas, and famously lived in a sparsely furnished room that he refused to let anyone enter. However, behind his playful quirks and minimalist compositions, Satie harbored a penchant for heavy drinking, a habit that would ultimately take a toll on his health. Satie's life took a tragic turn when he developed liver cirrhosis, likely exacerbated by years of excessive alcohol consumption. The once energetic composer began to suffer from severe abdominal pain and debilitating weakness. By the time his condition was diagnosed, his liver was beyond repair. Despite his illness, Satie continued to compose, producing some of his most introspective works in his final years. Satie's end came on July 1, 1925, at the age of 59. Alone in a Parisian hospital, his body gave out after years of neglect and abuse. Though his life ended in relative obscurity, Satie's unique musical voice would go on to influence generations, cementing his place as one of the most enigmatic figures in classical music history. While Satie's lifestyle contributed to his health struggles, other composers faced complications that arose from medical treatments gone awry. One such tragic case was Maurice Ravel, whose final years were overshadowed by a debilitating neurological condition and the tragic consequences of an ill-fated surgical intervention. Maurice Ravel, the French composer behind masterpieces like Bolero and Daphnis et Chloé, was celebrated for his innovative orchestrations and delicate, impressionistic style. Yet, his later years were marked by a tragic neurological decline that robbed him of his ability to compose. Ravel began experiencing symptoms of a mysterious neurological disorder in the late 1920s. His condition progressed to the point where he struggled to write despite retaining his ability to conceive music in his mind. Modern experts have speculated that Ravel may have suffered from a form of frontotemporal dementia, or that his condition resulted from a car accident in 1932. The latter incident, though seemingly minor at the time, appeared to accelerate the deterioration of his health. In 1937, Ravel underwent brain surgery in an attempt to alleviate his symptoms. Tragically, the procedure failed and left him in a worse state. Ravel fell into a coma shortly afterwards, and passed away on December 28, 1937, at the age of 62. His death left the music world mourning the loss of one of its most visionary composers. Ravel's tragic experience with a failed medical procedure finds an echo in the story of Giacomo Puccini, whose own life ended due to complications from surgery. Puccini, the celebrated composer behind operatic masterpieces such as La Bohème, Tosca, and Madame Butterfly, enjoyed worldwide fame and success. With his wealth, he indulged in the finest luxuries life could offer, including an unwavering love of expensive cigars. Tragically, this very indulgence may have sealed his fate. In 1923, Puccini began experiencing persistent throat pain, which was eventually diagnosed as cancer of the larynx. At the time, treatment options for such conditions were limited, but his wealth afforded him access to experimental radiation therapy in Brussels. In November 1924, he underwent surgery to implant radium needles directly into the tumor, a risky and cutting-edge procedure for the time. While the surgery initially showed promise, complications soon arose. Puccini developed a severe infection that spread rapidly, and his condition deteriorated. Despite the efforts of his doctors, he passed away on November 29, 1927, at the age of 65. His final opera, Turandot, remained unfinished at the time of his death, leaving a poignant reminder of a creative life cut short. Puccini's story is one of success tinged with tragedy, a theme that also surfaces in the life of Gioacchino Rossini, who also met his end following a surgical procedure. Rossini, the famous composer of The Barber of Seville and William Tell, was a man of indulgence, known for his love of good food, lively company, and a carefree lifestyle. However, these pleasures came at a cost. In his early 20s, Rossini contracted gonorrhea, a condition that would plague him for the rest of his life. The infection led to gonococcal urethritis, causing severe discomfort and making it excruciatingly difficult to urinate. To manage this condition, Rossini underwent regular and painful urethral dilations, an ordeal that no doubt added to his growing health complications as he aged. Despite these challenges, Rossini achieved extraordinary success and, by the age of 37, retired from opera composition at the height of his fame, but his retirement was far from carefree. His ongoing health issues persisted, and by the 1860s, they worsened. In 1868, Rossini was diagnosed with rectal cancer, for which he underwent surgery. Tragically, post-operative complications, including a severe infection, set in. With no effective treatments available, Rossini's condition deteriorated rapidly. On November 13, 1868, he succumbed to peritonitis at the age of 76. Rossini's indulgent lifestyle and struggles with venereal disease provides an interesting parallel to Franz Schubert, whose own battle with sexually transmitted illness likely led to an even earlier and more tragic end. For some composers, the exact cause of death remains uncertain, their final days clouded by speculation and debate. Such is the case with Franz Schubert, whose untimely death left more questions than answers. Schubert was by far one of the most prolific composers of the early Romantic era, leaving behind a treasure trove of symphonies, sonatas, and lieder. Yet, his life was tragically short, ending at just 31 years old. Having led a rather immoderate and unrestrained lifestyle, Schubert frequently indulged in the pleasures of Vienna's social scene, behaviors that likely contributed to his contraction of syphilis around 1822. The disease marked the start of a slow and painful deterioration. Schubert endured severe fevers, joint pain, and swelling, as well as a rash consistent with secondary syphilis. In his final months, his symptoms grew worse, including debilitating headaches, digestive issues, and what may have been signs of typhoid fever. His weight plummeted, and friends noted his increasingly gaunt appearance. On November 19, 1828, Schubert succumbed to his illness. While syphilis is often cited as the underlying cause, modern scholars debate whether his death was ultimately due to complications from the disease, such as meningitis, or an entirely separate condition, like typhoid fever, contracted through contaminated water. Schubert's tragically brief life ended with little fanfare, but his musical legacy ensured he would never be forgotten. Another composer whose death remains enigmatic is Robert Schumann, whose final years were overshadowed by his battle with mental illness and declining health. Robert Schumann, celebrated for his evocative piano works and symphonies, led a life as turbulent as his music. Known for his deep emotional sensitivity, Schumann's later years were marred by mental instability, which tragically overshadowed his brilliance. His death at the age of 46 has puzzled scholars for centuries. Schumann's struggles began in his mid-30s when he started experiencing auditory hallucinations and depressive episodes. These symptoms intensified, leading to his infamous attempt at ending his life in 1854 when he threw himself into the Rhine River. Shortly afterwards, he voluntarily admitted himself to an asylum in Endenich, where his condition deteriorated. A widely speculated cause of Schumann's decline is syphilis, an infection that was not at all uncommon during the 19th century. However, there is a significant contradiction. Clara, his wife and mother of his 8 children, never exhibited symptoms of the disease. Some scholars argue that his mental instability might have been due to other conditions, such as bipolar disorder or mercury poisoning from the treatments he received. Schumann passed away in 1856 after 2 years in the asylum. His cause of death is often cited as pneumonia. However, scholars continue to debate its validity, adding another layer of mystery to his tragic story, a prelude to the equally mysterious passing of Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky, celebrated for his emotionally rich symphonies and ballets like The Nutcracker and Swan Lake, remains one of the most beloved composers of all time. However, his death at the age of 53 is shrouded in mystery and controversy, with multiple theories competing for historical acceptance. Tchaikovsky was generally in good physical health throughout most of his life, which made his sudden death on November 6, 1893, just 9 days after the triumphant premiere of his Sixth Symphony, all the more shocking. Officially, cholera was named as the cause, reportedly contracted from drinking contaminated water during an outbreak in St. Petersburg. Yet, this explanation puzzled many, as cholera was primarily associated with lower-class communities, and a man of Tchaikovsky's high status would have been well aware of the precautions against it. In his final days, Tchaikovsky experienced severe diarrhea, agonizing muscle spasms, and kidney failure, symptoms consistent with advanced cholera. However, the speed of his deterioration and his sudden death fueled speculations of other causes. Theories range from potentially spurred by a feared scandal regarding his homosexuality, to poisoning allegedly orchestrated to protect Russia's conservative elite from disgrace. While the truth of his death may never be fully known, Tchaikovsky's Pathétique Symphony has been viewed as an eerily prophetic farewell, its melodies seeped in a profound sense of sorrow. His untimely end is one of music's great mysteries, echoing the enigma of Antonio Vivaldi, whose final years and death remain equally clouded. Antonio Vivaldi, best known for the Four Seasons, lived a life shaped by both remarkable creativity and persistent health struggles. From a young age, Vivaldi suffered from chronic respiratory problems, described as a tightness of the chest, which many speculate could have been asthma. These health issues were significant enough to influence his decision to step back from his duties as a priest, allowing him to focus entirely on his music. Despite his early success and recognition as one of the Baroque period's most prolific composers, Vivaldi's later years were marked by declining fortunes and obscurity. In 1740, he left his native Venice for Vienna, reportedly in hopes of securing a position at the imperial court. However, his health and finances were failing. On or around July 27, 1741, Vivaldi passed away at the age of 63, with historical accounts suggesting causes ranging from infection to malnutrition. He was buried in an unmarked grave, an ignoble end for a composer of such brilliance. Vivaldi's end also draws a parallel to that of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, whose premature death and burial in an unmarked grave continue to fuel questions to this day. Mozart, the unparalleled genius of the classical era, packed a lot into his short life. Known for masterpieces like The Magic Flute, Don Giovanni, and his unfinished Requiem, Mozart's life was tragically cut short at the age of 35. Yet, the exact cause of his death remains one of the most enduring mysteries in music history. From childhood, Mozart's health was precarious. He suffered frequent bouts of illness, including smallpox, tonsillitis, and rheumatic fever, which left him partially weakened. Despite these challenges, his prodigious talent flourished, and he became one of the most celebrated composers in history. In the final weeks of November 1791, Mozart became gravely ill, suffering from severe swelling, fever, vomiting, and excruciating pain. He reportedly told his wife that he believed he was being poisoned, a theory that sparked speculation for centuries. However, modern medical analysis suggests alternative explanations, including rheumatic fever, kidney disease, or streptococcal infection. His rapid decline, combined with Vienna's harsh winter and his intense workload, likely exacerbated his condition. On December 5, 1791, Mozart succumbed to his illness just 2 months shy of his 36th birthday. He left his Requiem incomplete, a haunting reflection of his untimely end. But what truly made his final days so unforgettable? From his eerie premonitions to the poignant moments shared with those closest to him, Mozart's last chapter offers a glimpse into the heart of a man whose music transcended his mortal struggles.